We're going to be in Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to be looking, as I said at the beginning, at Nebuchadnezzar's dream here in Daniel chapter 2. It says that in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, and I did not do the math this time to tell you how old Daniel was. I know he was 17 in chapter 1 or somewhere thereabouts, 85 in the lion's den, as we learned last time. So he's somewhere between 17 and 85. That pretty much covers it. In the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. So he has these dreams. And I would imagine to Nebuchadnezzar, he wants to look for meaning in this. And some of us are geared this way, I guess, that when, Jet talked about in class this morning, the idea of when good things or bad things are happening, we want to connect some kind of meaning to that. And so the person has done a good or bad thing to kind of lead toward that, and we know that that's not always the case. So as Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, he wants to know what's going on. And so he has around him all these magicians and wise men and all these different people, the Chaldeans, who he would call in for their wisdom and ask them about interpreting things. But he had an interesting idea this time. When he called in the Chaldeans this time, he wasn't going to just ask them what the dream meant after telling them. So if I were to come to you afterwards and say, okay, crazy dream I had where you all were in the church building in Cersei and Ken was annoyed that I was late and I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, what does all that mean? You could probably come up with something well, maybe it's this, or there's a pressure here, or this thing here, or whatever it is. But if I were to just come to you and say, I had a dream last night, tell me what it means. That's not going to work out quite as well, is it? And you really couldn't even make a whole lot up, because as soon as you began to give details, I would realize, well, you don't even know what my dream was. That's not what I dreamed about. I dreamed about something else. And so when Nebuchadnezzar wants his dream interpreted this time, he doesn't just want the interpretation, he wants the wise men to tell him what the dream is. And this is a trick they've never tried before, and they don't know exactly how it's going to work out. And even more so than that, Nebuchadnezzar's idea is, and if you can't do this thing that just doesn't even seem realistic, then you're going to die, and it's going to be unpleasant. And so this is the task that's set before them. So in verse 10, the Chaldeans, these wise men, answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. So the Chaldeans realize, this thing you're asking us to do, this is not possible. Now, we have probably, maybe not quite at this level where it really literally would not be possible for us to do, but we have probably been given tasks somewhere along the way that we think, well, this thing, that's not, bless you, that thing is not possible. We can't do that. And maybe sometimes it's something within the life that you live, or a task you've been given to do at work. Maybe sometimes it's something that God has given us. When we look at the idea of take the gospel to the entire world, that's a pretty big job. And yet at the same time, I was reading a book a couple weeks ago that talked about the idea that on the pace we are with spreading the gospel with mission work, within our lifetime, the gospel will actually hit the entire world. Now, but they may not accept it, but every tribe, every nation, everywhere, it's going to get there. And so these guys back in Acts chapter 1 that may have thought, well, how's that supposed to work exactly? It was actually doable. So the Chaldeans here say, this is not possible. And in 1 Corinthians 2, I think we have kind of the New Testament look at this. It says, who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? I don't know if we read this one in class, but it applies pretty well. Who knows what's going on with another person? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Only God is going to know all these things. Only God can see all these things. Yes, it's not possible when it comes to us, but it is possible with God. So continuing to verse 11, the Chaldeans continue to say, the thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with the flesh. And so they say, okay, this is not possible, and almost kind of looking into what 1 Corinthians 2 is going to say later, except for the gods, the way they say it. But the gods, they're not here. They do not, as the NIV puts it, they do not dwell among humans. So if we can kind of combine these two translations a little bit, the gods don't dwell among people. Whether you want to think of it in terms of flesh or people or humans or whatever, this is not where they are. And so they could do this, but we can't do this. Now, it's interesting the terminology they use here of the idea of the gods not dwelling among people, because as we're going to see Daniel get involved in this in a few minutes, Daniel serves a God who does. Our God does dwell among people. Isn't that the entire story of Scripture? And even us being here this morning? God begins way back early on having conversations with Adam, and then he's walking in the garden, and then with his people as they're being led out of slavery in Egypt, there's the cloud and the fire that goes before them. There's the tent where he's going to be. Later on, there's a temple where he's going to be. And then Nebuchadnezzar and the people of Babylon, they destroy this temple, and yet God still dwells with his people and always will, to the point where we reach the New Testament in Jesus' very name, Emmanuel, God with us. God is dwelling with his people. So the magicians, the Chaldeans, they don't understand who God is and what he does. And their very language betrays that fact. So in verse 12 it says, because of this, the king was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the king's reaction to all this is anger. He is mad, and then he starts lashing out. And again, I think we find ourselves in this place from time to time where things are not going in the way we'd like them to go. And sometimes the things that we have asked of someone else, they're not realistic. They don't make sense. But when those things don't happen, we get angry. Or when God doesn't, as we think of God answering prayers, when God doesn't answer prayer in the way that we'd like it answered. When you look at Job and his friends that we looked at in class this morning, when things don't go the way we want them to go, sometimes it's confusion, sometimes it's sadness, sometimes it is anger. And what we will find with ourselves, like we do with Nebuchadnezzar here, is when you're angry, your decision-making doesn't go all that well. And so Nebuchadnezzar, in his anger, wants to put these wise men to death. And if we could, just the obvious flaw in the plan here, if you put all these Chaldeans, all these wise men, all these magicians to death, then when you have another dream tomorrow night, and you actually think, well, maybe I'll go ahead and tell somebody the details of this and find out what it means, there's no one left to tell you. You've killed them all. It doesn't make any sense at all, and yet this is the plan that he has. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. So Daniel is counted among these wise men. So Daniel's reaction, I think, is what we'll look at in the next few verses. Because the king, as he reacts in anger, Daniel reacts in a very different way. And I think a way that we can look to today in the world in which we live and learn a lot about how to react when things aren't going our way. When the world around us seems crazy and out of control, when God is not answering in the way that we'd like for God to answer, when people around us are acting out of anger, how do we react to that? Because normally what happens is when there is anger that is there, what do? We lash back. We feel kind of justified in it, don't we? We feel like, well, I deserve this. I should be able to do this. And so Daniel's reaction is very, very different than that. When faced with something unreasonable, this is how Daniel reacts. So Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel's reaction begins with prudence as he declares to Arioch, the king's captains, why is the decree of the king so urgent? And then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. So with prudence, he goes and he says, why is this so urgent? Why is the king reacting in the way he does? Because all these things are happening outside of where Daniel is. And so rather than just say, well, this is unreasonable and unjust and unfair, all of which is true, but all of which Daniel is probably not in the position to say or do anything about, he says, what is this all about? To try to understand. Daniel, who probably is pretty confident that he's in a more right spot than where Nebuchadnezzar is, still wants to better understand what Nebuchadnezzar is thinking. For us, what if we acted within the same way? When we feel like everything is wrong, everything is unjust, everything is unfair, what if rather than lashing out or being frustrated, what if our response is to try to better understand? It's not going to magically make it right, but if we can understand and hear other people, the conversation is a very different thing. And so Daniel says, well, what is this all about? And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. So he acts prudently, and then it is also measured. It is not, I'm going to drop everything I'm doing and run to the king, which you just didn't do in that day and time. You didn't just walk into the presence of the king unannounced. He says, why don't we get a time where I can go and talk to the king about this? It's hard to do, isn't it? I was thinking the other day about early married life for us and premarital counseling that we did and several of these things. I remember I would have an argument occasionally with my wife because I hadn't figured out she was right yet. And I would have an argument and I would think, she'll see this my way eventually, and I would want to, because the way I'm geared, the way I like things, I would want to resolve that argument then and there in that moment. It's a disagreement, if you don't like argument. We would have this disagreement, and I would want it resolved. And there would sometimes come a point where if the disagreement was pretty tense and pretty difficult, that my wife would want to leave the room. And I would think to myself, how dare you? We're having a conversation here. We're upset about it. We need to fix this and make it right now. And she would want to leave the room because in her mind what was going on was, if I stay here with this unreasonable man very much longer, I'm going to say something that's not going to be very nice. And so I need to walk out of the room and kind of cool down a little bit, and then we'll come back to this discussion again. And I realized she's right. That's probably the thing that should be happening right now is, okay, let's take a minute, step back, figure out what's going on, and then talk it through. How often do we, like Nebuchadnezzar, but without the power that he has, just react and then run full force into whatever it is? And so Daniel, instead of running full force back into that, says, okay, let's get a time where we can sit down and I can tell you about this dream. And then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, who you probably know better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He goes back to his house and talks to these guys, so his reaction is also together. He does not want to do this on his own. Now, there will come a time that we talked about last time in Daniel 6, which is actually ahead of the story that we're talking about here, where he will be on his own with God. But here, he still has his companions and he thinks, let's handle this together. How often do you catch yourself saying something like, I don't want to burden somebody else with this. I don't want to bother somebody else with this thing. How often does somebody want to do something kind for you and you feel awkward about it and you don't want to let them do that thing and you want to do it yourself? I was thinking of Wendell this morning, who's in the hospital down in Oklahoma City. I've been out to lunch with Wendell a few times. I hesitate to go to lunch with Wendell because he always grabs the check. And I always feel awkward about it. And I always say, Wendell, I didn't come to lunch with you because I want you to pay for it. I came to lunch with you because I wanted to be at lunch with you and talk and all of that. And Wendell will always say the same thing. And if you've been to lunch with Wendell, you've probably heard it. I've still got money I haven't spent yet. And then Wendell will grab the check from you and he will pay for it. And I think to myself, I struggle with that. Sometimes if you get a compliment, you may struggle with taking it the right way. Or when you have a burden, you struggle sharing it because you think, this is my burden. I need to handle this on my own. Daniel recognizes that here in exile, part of the strength I have is in these people who believe what I believe. And as we think about exile this morning, as we're here in a world that seems to have gone awry at times, our strength is here, isn't it? And not just here on Sunday as we're sitting on pews. It's here with this group of people as we do life together. And so he goes back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So he goes to them together, and they go to God in prayer. They want to ask for God's help in this. And so with this formidable force in front of them, the one who everyone else would assume has all of the power in this situation, Daniel says, because we are together and because God is with us, it's going to be okay. Wherever this is going to go, whatever's going to happen, it's going to be all right. And so they go to God and they ask. And then in verse 19, the beginning of the verse, it says, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. And so in the midst of all of this, we see God's reaction, which is revelation. God shows Daniel what he needs to see. Now, I think God still does this more than we give him credit for, and I think we are too foolish to see it a lot of the time. How many times have you had something just right there in front of you and you miss it? How many times has something been so obvious when you look back on it but you didn't see it when it was right there when you're in the moment. I think God still reveals quite a bit to us. And here to Daniel, he reveals to him everything he's going to need to know. Reveals the dream to him, what the dream is going to mean, so he can take that back to Nebuchadnezzar. And then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So Daniel's reaction continues with, he's now thankful. Because he has gone to God with this thing that he just is completely out of power with. This thing that threatens his life. And God gives him what he needs, and he is thankful for that. So his prayer is one of thanksgiving in that moment. So this is Daniel's prayer. And I want you to pay special note to the verbs we see in the prayer, the actions that are things that Daniel is doing or thinking, things that God is doing or thinking, and see what is on Daniel's mind. So Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever." Give praise to God, to whom belong wisdom and might. So these things that Nebuchadnezzar is asking the wise men for, these are things that belong to God. Nebuchadnezzar's asking the wrong person. Daniel knows exactly who to ask. And so blessed be God, because these things that are needed right now, those are things that belong to God. He changes times and seasons. Why was it a little bit cooler yesterday than the day before? Because God did that. Why is it probably going to be very, very hot very, very soon? Because God did that too. He changes all of those things. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Why is Nebuchadnezzar where he is? Because God is sovereign. Why will Nebuchadnezzar not be where he is very much longer? Because God is sovereign. Why are we in all of the situations of the world even today that we're in? God is sovereign. And regardless of whether we think good or bad, right people, wrong people, God is still sovereign over all of it. He removes, sets up. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. You cannot buy it from him. You cannot try to coerce it. He will give it to those who he feels need it through his discernment. He reveals deep and hidden things. There are things about God, things about our world that you can never know unless God wants you to know that. Why are there scientists who are convinced that the world is 4.3 whatever billion years old? And there are people on the other end of the spectrum that are convinced that our world is 6,000 however many years old? Because God made it that way. And you will never fully know the exact things unless he reveals it. Why are things the way they are? Why is God able to do what God can do and we don't? Because God reveals exactly what he wants us to know. Why does Nebuchadnezzar have a crazy dream? And then rather than just asking for an interpretation to the dream, asking for, well, what's the dream in the first place? Because God reveals what God wants to reveal. He knows what is in the darkness. So God has all knowledge of the things we can't see. Because what is in the darkness, that's the stuff you can't see. Every year when I open the door to the storm shelter, getting ready to use it for the first time, I wonder to myself, what is down there this time? And I will go down those steps with a flashlight, looking everywhere I can look. And when I get down there, I know there are corners and a couple places that you really have to, and I'm looking everywhere. But I don't know until the light gets shined on it. God sees all of those things. And the light dwells in him. He is light. And this is part of Daniel's prayer. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. What can we do for God? All we can do is give to him. We have no power, no coercion. We just give to him what we can give. And in this case, thanks and praise. For you have chosen to give me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. Everything we know that we wouldn't know otherwise is because God has allowed it. God has given us that knowledge. He has made those things known to us. So what does Daniel's prayer acknowledge? It acknowledges God's wisdom and his might and his sovereignty and his generosity, his discernment, deciding who he's going to give what to and all of that, his revelation, the fact that we can't know unless he reveals, and the fact that he's revealing out of his own knowledge because he knows all that there is to know. And isn't it interesting that Daniel prays this prayer in the midst of the lack of freedom, in exile, in a place where people are being told to bow down to statues, and people are being told to eat certain kinds of food, and later are going to be told they can't pray only to the king. All of these things that are against them in the world in which they live, and Daniel in his prayer can see all of this about God. Why is it so hard for us to see the same things? Why is it so hard for us when the world does something that's awful and wrong and unjust and against Christianity, and we feel like we're persecuted and all of that? Why can we not see what Daniel sees here? Because it is all every bit as clear in 2023 as it was between ages 17 and 85 for Daniel. Daniel knows that God is all of these things. And when we feel alone in our world and like no one understands, God is still all of these things. So Daniel's actions, they're going to help others see these things about God. As Daniel lives and lives in the way that he does, other people are going to see God more clearly because of how Daniel lives, reacts, what he does, because of his spirit. In chapter 2, verse 24, Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation." So now he reacts in confidence. This guy who has come here with the message that you're going to die because all the wise men are going to die, you now go back to the man that gave that order, and you let him know we're ready to talk now. Because we have the dream, we have the interpretation. So he goes into the king, and the king says, "Are you able to make it known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation?" in verse 26. Are you able? It's interesting how this shifts between chapter 2 and chapter 26. You have a different king on the throne, by the way, in between those times. We get to Darius in chapter 6 that we looked at last week with the lion's den. And you'll remember Darius asked a question too. As Daniel is in the lion's den and Darius has gone the next morning to see if he is still alive in there, Darius's question is, was your God able to save you? Because of how Daniel has lived among these chapters, even the questions others ask have begun to change. Nebuchadnezzar is looking for the ability in people. And Daniel lives in such a way that they are looking for the ability in God. So he says, "Are you able?" And Daniel answered, "No. Wise men, enchanters, magicians, astrologers can show the king that the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be of the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this, and he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be." Daniel reacts in humility. It's not me that's going to reveal anything, it's my God. I serve a God who reveals mysteries. That's the God that we serve today. And he is the one who is going to change this. He is the one that's going to let you know. And we're not going to get into the interpretation of the dream. If you want to read about that, you can. It's about kingdoms coming and going and falling and rising and all of that stuff. But to me, it's not really even the point of the chapter. And by the way, all of the kingdoms coming and going that Daniel talks about, those all come true. That all happens. But the point of this is how God reacts and how Daniel reacts. And Daniel here reacting in humility, the king comes back to him and says this in verse 47, "Truly your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Daniel's actions helped Nebuchadnezzar to see who God is. Now, we know enough about Nebuchadnezzar to know that doesn't necessarily stick all the time. Nebuchadnezzar very much has his ups and downs, much like people around our world do. But in this moment, he is able to see God because of what Daniel has done. In the New Testament, Jesus talks about it this way. In Matthew 5 and verse 14 in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light in all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see the good works, your good works, and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Our actions can help people see who God is. So why was this called Power in Exile? And I've told you before, I always struggle with the titles. I think it's a story of power Because you have a character in the beginning in Nebuchadnezzar that thinks he is the one in control and in power, and you have a story that plays out that shows God is in control and in power. And I think we live at a time in history where sometimes we feel kind of powerless as a church in the culture in which we live. And I think history will show that God is the one who has power. And he calls on us to live in such a way that people see that it's obvious that we know that God is the one who is sovereign, God is in control. This morning, if you feel like you live in an ungodly world, it kind of feels that way sometimes. But know that you can come to the God who is in power, you can be baptized in the name of his Son, and your life can be changed forever. Or if you have walked away from that, the stuff around you in the world has just really borne down on you, and you have got that message like from Nebuchadnezzar where you just feel like you're so out of control and things are so wrong, know that you can come back to him, walk with him again, and like Daniel, you can recognize he is the one who is able to do what it is that you're asking for. If there's some way we can help you in any of these ways or to pray for you, please come while we stand and sing.